Okay, and the second half of this chapter involves Chapter 8, Psychological Disorders and Stress. Where we're going to begin is with the issue of psychological disorders, and in fact, we're going to spend most of our time on psychological disorders, covering the basics that are in the DSM-5 today, and then moving on to a short section of stress afterward. To understand where the DSM came from, which you may be familiar with, but if you're not, I'm going to explain it here on this slide. The DSM is the abbreviation for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. And that is a very long title for a book, but it is very descriptive. It is a book of diagnoses that is based on statistics, and it was created by psychiatrists, not psychologists. And that's a very important point to recognize for both historical reasons and based on who's actually updating the book currently. The development of this book came about, again, largely as a reaction to Freud's work. As I mentioned an hour ago earlier in the lecture, Freud was pretty much a guru in his time, and when he dies in 1939 and people feel more comfortable criticizing him, over the coming decade or so, psychiatrists start to get together and recognize that Freud's diagnostic system for psychiatric disorders is actually very bad. There's a lot of problems with it. So as a result, what they do is they decide that the best way to identify what a psychological disorder might actually be is to let everybody contribute the types of symptoms or types of problems that psychologists and psychiatrists are experiencing at that time during the 1940s and combine everything together in a statistical manner to see what types of things people consider disorders. That way you don't have to be judgmental about a psychological disorder. You simply draw out what people don't feel comfortable with and then identify that and then group it all together in a demographic statistic. And that's essentially what happens over the course of about 10 years or so. So in 1952, the very first version of the DSM came out. And the DSM, as you see here, is in currently its fifth version. So every 10 to 20 years or so, it gets updated because culture changes, and also there's new updated research on psychological disorders. So as a result, you have to kind of go back and reorganize the categories. So there were categories of psychological disorder that existed 30 years ago that don't exist now. There are disorders that are recharacterized and renamed as new editions of the DSM come out. So you have to be very careful when you talk about disorders because it's a constantly changing process, and that changing process reflects the fact properly that psychiatrists and the other people involved in this process are fully aware that they don't know everything about psychological disorders, which is a good, humble approach to take. And therefore, they make an attempt to categorize the disorder, and if they realize that there's new data has come in and they need to change it, then they do so. And that is a far better process than anything Freud ever came up with, because in Freud's time, when Freud spoke the first time, that was it. Whatever he said was gold, and nobody could argue with it. And that's just absolutely counter to the process of science or logic in general. So, oddly enough, this book, the psychological disorder system that we have now, I think it's good to recognize from a historical standpoint, largely exists because the community of psychiatrists, who only existed because Freud was the person who created the field of psychiatry, completely rejected him after he died. That is a absolutely remarkable story. It tells you in two extreme ways: how popular Freud was during his time, and also how hated he was by people outside of his community and even within his own community. Now, one of the primary approaches that we've had since about 1972 that becomes a core component to understanding all behavior. Okay, I know we're on a psychological disorders chapter, but the biopsychosocial approach here is used to understand psychological disorders, but it is used more generally to understand all behavior. And this is a very good thing to be aware of, because this is a system that's not just for psychological disorders. It is a basic system that helps you understand all patterns of behavior. The biopsychosocial approach involves three primary factors: a biological, a psychological, and a social aspect. What this is really doing in a bit more detail is reflecting nature-nurture. The fact that behavior can be managed by biology, whether it's genes or even just sympathetic nervous system activity, separately from the environment. So there are two primary factors that control behavior: biology and environment. In the biopsychosocial approach in 1972, when this model was originally created as a way to help understand alcoholism, the environmental component, nurture, was split into two categories: psycho and social. The psychological one refers to things that happen to a person's individual life, personal history issues. In fact, when somebody says today, if they're speaking properly, psychological effects of such and such, psychological effects mean something very specific. They mean things that happen to you, right? So you, from your point of view, from your personal life history, from the physical location where you were, where you perceived an event occur, those all kind of combine together to form a personal event, a psychological cause. And social reflects very specifically the culture that you're in. Some cultures will cause stress for individuals for some types of disorders, and other cultures will kind of alleviate stress on individuals for the same types of disorders. So it kind of depends literally on the arbitrary geopolitical border that you reside in when the disorder occurs, as to know how much of a problem the event will actually induce in you. So when you take a look at these three categories, the biological causes, right, all based around basic biological things like genes, hormones, and diseases. That's the nature aspect, right? From nature, nurture. Nature always refers to biology. Nurture, that refers to the environment, is now represented in the bottom two categories. Psychological causes, which are things that happen from your own point of view. And secondly, culture. All of the things that involve culture, which of course changes over time. And because this biopsychosocial approach is the basic way in which people understand all behavior, you have to recognize that as culture changes over time, like every, let's say, 20 years in the current point in history, you do get some significant changes. In fact, even 20 years ago, much of social media didn't even exist. And now it's just constantly in your face. And it has affected culture. So as these things occur, you have to update the diagnostic and statistical manual, because if culture changes, it may influence the prevalence or intensity of types of psychological disorders, and that has to be represented in that book. So unlike medical disorders like the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases, where it might identify breast cancer or malaria or something else like that, and that's just a disease, and it could have happened 2,000 years ago, it could happen 2,000 years in the future. It's one thing, and that's all that happens. In terms of psychological disorders, that's not true. The disorder occurs within a social context, and if the social context constantly changes, then the type of disorder that might occur in the year 1990 could be different than in 2000, than in 2010, and even different in 2020. And that's an important thing to be aware of, because some disorders may disappear from the historical record and just never come back, and some may intensify. It's just a matter of evaluating how these things play themselves out. Now, there are 4 categories that you have to identify, and you also have to figure out why the heck Stalin is on a slide for psychological disorders here. 4 categories to identify abnormal behavior. And let me explain this again in a historical standpoint. From Freud's psychological system, his diagnostic system, the psychiatrist determined psychological disorders, declared what it was, and that was the end of it. This was a very top-down process. In fact, it worked very much like a medical doctor does even today to some degree, where the medical doctor says, well, you've got this particular disease and that's it. They write it in their chart. They submit a claim to the insurance company. It's essentially treated as though you have that particular disorder because one person said so. When it came to psychological disorders, there were a great number of abuses. In fact, Freud, I don't believe he set up the system intending to have abuse, but there were abuses from the system to have only one person determine a psychological disorder of another individual. And some of those abuses, even though there's a whole long chain of them that you could talk about, the one that I'm kind of pointing out here are the ones actually used by governments in the early 20th century. People like Stalin and Hitler and a variety of other dictators around the globe essentially would say, if a citizen of our country does not agree with our government rules, then we can declare them as mentally ill because clearly they're not thinking straight. And so, you may be aware of political dissidents in the Soviet Union, and they would get jailed or placed in psychiatric facilities largely as a way just to shut them up. Because they're busy writing secret documents, they would write pamphlets and then they would distribute them in their local community and people would pass them around. And eventually the KGB would figure out who was doing it. They would arrest that individual and place them in a psychiatric facility. They could have outright just shot the person in the head, though, too. And that happened a number of times. Sometimes people go off to Siberian gulags. Sometimes they go to prison. Sometimes they go to a psychiatric facility. I think it probably depended on the specifics of the case. But the point was, these declarations of mental illness came from a scenario where one person who was a government-hired psychiatrist in the Soviet Union declared the issue of mental illness. And as a result, that being Freud's original system, by the 1960s, it was clear that that system had a lot of problems with it. And even in a more of a local, personal basis, there would be abuses between a psychiatrist and somebody who had brought somebody in for treatment and so forth. So a way to eliminate these kinds of social abuses of having one person declare mental illness was to have a representative from each of the 3 sections of the biopsychosocial approach. Essentially, a medical doctor, a psychologist, and a social worker. And each one of those 3 individuals has to make a determination on each of these 4 categories about whether or not a person has a psychological disorder. And so the gold standard is that each of these 3 individuals has to say yes to each of these 4 categories, so that overall there are going to be 12 yes comments regarding a psychological disorder existing, and that should minimize the amount of abuse in the system. As you might imagine, you could still have abuses in the system, right? If a wife has her husband committed who's rich, and she promises the 3 members of the biopsychosocial committee money, like $1 million, to have her husband committed so she can legally take over his wealth, and she could be done with him, and then these people at the psychiatric facility all make $1 million apiece. Certainly that kind of thing could happen. So the system is not perfect today, but it is much better than it was based on the system that Freud created. So the 4 categories that you have to evaluate are this: statistical infrequency. Any pattern of behavior that occurs much less or much more than the rest of society is possible to be identified as a psychological disorder. Right? It doesn't automatically mean if you do something a lot more or a lot less than other people, doesn't automatically mean that's a psychological disorder. There's going to have to be some reason based upon the other 3 categories about why you're actually identifying as a potential problem. But if the problem in question occurs statistically to essentially the same amount of most people in society, then it simply is off the table. You cannot declare it a psychological disorder. And so even if you keep this in mind, as time changes and culture changes, types of disorders will come and go based upon change in culture, because the patterns of behavior that people exhibit will be more or less likely identified as statistically infrequent. Disability or dysfunction refers to a secondary problem that is caused as a result of the disorder in question. So if you have a homeless person that lives in Miami, and homeless people, of course, living out on the street, get a lot of sun exposure, and after being out there for 10 years, a homeless person might be covered in skin cancers. You could declare that the skin cancers were in existence secondary to whatever was causing them to be homeless, right? And so that would be the disability or the dysfunction in that case. Of course, you could argue the point and also say that the person has the right to live on the street if they want to, and since you're not going to consider homelessness as a psychological problem, you would not consider the skin cancers as an issue either. That's a part of the wiggle room that you have in this system. Personal distress. Personal distress is something that many people are not aware of, that when a person has an actual psychological disorder, it is very likely that they are uncomfortable with the problem in question. And even when they are fully psychotic and you can get them to calm down and become more lucid through a temporary use of medication, the person will tell you whether or not they were seeing things or hearing voices and whether or not they were comfortable with it. Very consistently, whether it's a minor degree of obsessive compulsive disorder, which a lot of people claim to have, anxiety, or even just full-blown psychosis, people simply don't like these types of problems, and so they will report personal distress. And then a violation of norms. The violation of norms almost seems like a duplication of statistical infrequency, but it is more specifically related to you personally violating cultural norms of your society. And so there could be issues regarding how paranoid you are, how much you accuse people of being against you, the degree to which you touch or refuse to be touched by other individuals. There's all sorts of ways in which just basic norms that you probably don't even think about every day because they're so incorporated into your behavior that you're not even aware of them, that a person could violate them in a manner to give you a yes, check mark for that category. So again, it's a kind of a gold standard with a medical doctor, a psychologist, and a social worker all saying yes to each of those 4 categories, giving you 12 total yeses. That's your gold standard for identifying a psychological disorder. Is it true that you can go to a psychologist and that person will say, I think you have an anxiety disorder, and that will be the end of the diagnostic system? In that case, yes. Yes, it is. But it's not the gold standard today. You'll get the gold standard because of the greater labor intensity of it in places like a fully functioning psychiatric facility. If you go to a psychologist and they say that you have an anxiety disorder, that also, kind of just like with a medical doctor, puts you in a position to question whether or not you should have a second diagnosis from another psychologist. But that's kind of an open-ended question overall and part of the wiggle room that you have in the current system. Now, when we take a look on this slide, there are a total of 12 disorders that your Princeton Review book covers. The first 9 are in red because those are the first 9 that your book will actually cover in some detail. Why 10, 11, and 12 are actually not covered in any detail is not really clear to me. But we're going to cover the first 9. You should be aware of all 12. And each of these disorders, you could spend an entire semester on individually. We're going to have to go through them in a very broad manner to get an idea of what they look like. And we'll go through them in the order that they're on the page. So we'll start off with anxiety disorders. Anxiety disorders have 3 primary subtypes: panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and phobia. And those 3 disorders are really all connected to each other with one underlying process, which you might imagine is just anxiety. In fact, the category of anxiety disorders exists simply because as you categorize all the different ways that psychological disorders could occur in an individual, you take all the disorders that have anxiety as a primary symptom and you lump them together. And that's how anxiety disorders are developed. It's not really so much a human-made process, but it's just a very straightforward logical system that you take common symptoms and you lump them together, and then you wind up seeing that there is such a thing as anxiety disorders. Now, of panic disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and phobia, there is an underlying structure that you see in all of them. In a panic disorder, what happens is an individual will go about their day, nothing strange, and then possibly for about 20 to 30 minutes, they will go into an intense anxiety experience, and that will essentially incapacitate them. And after the end of the 20 to 30 minutes, it'll just go away, and they'll feel exhausted at that point. But that anxiety will just appear and then disappear, and there won't be any known particular event in the environment that causes it to occur. Really, you can draw it back probably to stress in the person's life, but it's not like they stepped into the street and almost got hit by a car and then had an anxiety reaction, right? There's not a specific setting event at that very moment. You have anxiety through your life, probably through a long period of time, and then you have these somewhat randomly induced anxiety periods during the course of the day. That's a panic disorder. Now, if you took all of the anxiety that a person experiences in a panic disorder and you spread it out over the course of the entire day, so the amount of anxiety they experienced moment by moment was much less, but it was just drawn out over the course of 24 hours, that would essentially be a generalized anxiety disorder. A person wakes up and goes to sleep and feels anxious all day long. When they feel anxious when they wake up, and they feel anxious right before they go to sleep. They're just always anxious. That's a generalized anxiety disorder. And then, of course, a phobia, like you see with this spider on the screen here, is something that disgusts a lot of people. And a person will become extremely fearful of the spider itself. And in fact, the amount of anxiety a person experiences in a really intense phobia will be roughly equivalent to what a person might have in a panic disorder. But in a phobic response, what you actually see is that there is a very clear setting event for the anxiety. You bring the spider in the room, the person freaks out. You remove the spider from the room, the person calms down. What about the panic disorder? Well, it just appeared randomly and then it just stopped at some point. There didn't seem to be any event in the environment that actually caused it to occur. So if you take a look at these three disorders, they actually have this underlying structure where a generalized anxiety disorder occurs in a low-level anxiety across the entire day. If you take all that anxiety and you squeeze it into a 20-minute period and give no environmental setting relation to it, then it's called a panic disorder. But if you have that intense anxiety that occurs in a short period of time and you have a very clear environmental source for it, then it's referred to as a phobia. So you can kind of see that, there is a structure to the way that these anxiety disorders are actually identified. Now, in phobias, there are specific phobias like a phobia for heights or a phobia for a spider like this. And of course, there are social anxiety disorders where people feel anxious when they are around other individuals or they have to talk to people and they become extremely anxious or uncomfortable under those circumstances. Social anxiety disorder is something that has been around for a very long period of time, but only kind of has gotten more play over time, more recently, over probably the past 20 to 30 years. The next category is the obsessive compulsive disorder. Obsessive compulsive disorder has an odd name that you need to be very careful about. Obsessive and compulsive really generally seem to be synonyms, but they're used in a technical form here. Obsessive refers to repeated thoughts. Does not have anything to do with overt actions, just repeated thoughts. And then compulsion refers to repeated patterns of behavior, but it is not referring to any thoughts. So obsessions refer to thoughts, compulsions refer to behavior. So obsessive compulsive disorder includes repeated thoughts and repeated patterns of behavior. It is possible to see obsessive thinking without compulsive behavior, and in much more rare cases, it is possible to see compulsive behavior without obsessive thoughts. But the most likely scenario is obsessive thoughts occurring with compulsive patterns of behavior. In general, when you take a look at obsessive compulsive disorder, it generally follows the same cyclic pattern. For an individual with this disorder, there is always some degree of background thinking regarding something, an obsessive thought about something, like a fear of germs. And so when you have these obsessive thoughts occurring, those obsessive thoughts cause anxiety. The anxiety leads to a pattern of behavior that allows you to alleviate the anxiety. Whatever compulsive behavior that will alleviate anxiety is going to be the next component of the disorder, the compulsion. The compulsion relieves the anxiety, but the obsessive thoughts have never gone away, so the anxiety continues to build up again. So for a person with a low-grade obsessive compulsive disorder regarding dirt, germs, and toxins, they always kind of feel in a very minor way that things are contaminated around them. And over the course of 2-3 hours, they feel a very strong need to wash their hands or take a shower or change their clothes or do something else that's related to a hygienic practice that will alleviate some of that stress. But the thinking never goes away, so the anxiety continues to build up again. In really severe forms of OCD, the obsessive thinking will be very strong, and the compulsions will have to be much more intense, and the cycle will occur in a much more rapid fashion. The top 3 types of obsessions and compulsions that currently exist are shown here on the right side of the slide. Dirt, germs, and toxins, and hygienic activities being the most common. The second most common OCD is a generalized fear of something bad happening, almost somewhat similar to like a superstitious thinking. Like, oh, if I step on this crack, something bad's going to happen. If I take my car keys out of my pocket with my left hand, somebody's going to die. It's just some kind of odd thought process like that. And oftentimes people will wind up alleviating the anxiety they experience by developing some irrational repeating ritual, something that has obviously nothing to do with these generalized ideas. So if you throw salt over your shoulder or knock on wood or spin around 3 times, you might wind up feeling better as a result. And the third most common OCD is a feeling that things have to be very orderly, and people will check doors and windows. They'll stack their groceries in the cabinets at home so they're perfectly organized, and that will be largely the way it will play itself out. If you're hearing these OCDs and you're thinking, oh my God, I think I got that one, chances are actually you probably do, but not to a clinical level. I have evaluated in large classrooms, like classrooms of size 300, over the past decade or so, and ask my students through an eye clicker whether or not they feel they have any low-grade OCD. And I very consistently, class by class, over the course of the past decade, find that nearly 90% of my class reports that they feel they have some sort of low-grade OCD. And that itself is proof that they don't have OCD. Why? Well, because it doesn't fit the statistical infrequency requirement to declare a mental illness that we saw on the previous slide. If it is very common that people have a low-grade obsessive thought and minor compulsive behavior, then that is just what exists in our culture, and therefore it cannot be a psychological disorder. There has to be something much more damaging and disruptive to behavior before you'll actually see it diagnosed as an OCD. It does tell you something more generally about society today, which many social psychologists have actually identified, and that is the level of anxiety that people experience in industrialized societies today is actually much higher than it has been in recorded history. For the time that social psychologists or clinicians have been able to identify levels of anxiety, there's just so much going on, so much stimulation from the news, social media, life events, the ability to get in your car and go somewhere, all the time. There's always something to do. There's always a problem to address. Anxiety is at a very high in society now, and it's not surprising then that you find these low-grade forms of OCD extremely common in society. The next disorder, trauma and stressor-related disorders. This one primarily refers to PTSD. More than anything, that's the primary one. PTSD does involve a lot of anxiety, and it had been previously identified under the anxiety category, but when the DSM-5 came out, PTSD was moved into its own category because despite the fact that it has anxiety as a primary function, it does not really match up very closely with the phobia and generalized anxiety disorder from the other category. So an entirely new category was created, trauma and stressor-related disorders. But regardless of how you categorize it, PTSD is still going to be PTSD. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a type of disorder that really didn't get to be recognized probably until around the 1960s or so, minimally. You'll kind of see it up to around 20% of the population of combat veterans may experience it to some degree. And, all PTSD is not going to wind up being the same. Some people have it for years. Some people have it for much shorter periods of time. In fact, on this screen here, you're actually going to see that the length of time in which the person has symptoms will actually establish the particular category, whether they have PTSD or acute stress disorder, for example. Now, PTSD may be most commonly associated with combat scenarios, but it actually occurs for a wide range of types of life stressors. Things like being a victim of a violent crime, or even witnessing a violent crime or some other stressful event. So if you're walking down the street and you see a person get hit by a car, you may later on that day start to have flashbacks. And if the flashbacks don't go away and they last for longer than a month, then it would be called a PTSD. Simply because if it lasts only up to about a month, it would be called acute stress disorder, as you see on the screen. But if it lasts longer than a month, then it formally becomes PTSD. That's just a rough estimate, right? That 1 month, that is part of the S from the DSM. It's a statistical estimate based on the amount of stress people experience in general that have disorders like this, and how well they have recovered from the disorder over time on their own, with treatment or without treatment. So the 1 month estimate is a statistical one that came from some research that was done to evaluate how long these stress responses exist. Which is really telling you that acute stress disorder is really largely the same thing as PTSD, symptomatically. It just doesn't last as long. Adjustment disorder, which you may have actually heard of, is a lower grade form of the same type of thing, except it may come from another type of life stressor that involves a great degree of change in your life, such as a divorce, a move to a new city, a loss of a career. If you were put in jail for 3 months, you might wind up with an adjustment disorder during that time period because it's going to be extremely difficult to adjust to your life in jail for 3 months. In the next category, the somatic symptom disorder, you actually see some of the original disorders that Freud was working with. Conversion disorder. You may remember back with Freud, in Vienna, Austria in the 1890s, conversion disorder appeared to be a very common type of psychological disorder. It's extremely uncommon in North America in the 21st century, but it seemed to be much more prevalent back in Europe in the 1890s. And so when Freud was doing his work, he saw a lot of people with different forms of conversion disorder. Hysterical blindness was one. Also loss of limb control, which I mentioned in the previous chapter. It was a common thing that a person would just go to bed with 4 functioning limbs and wake up in the morning and they wouldn't be able to walk, or one of their legs would just be limp, or they couldn't use their hand or their arm or some other such thing. Those conversion disorders largely seem to be coming from forms of stress, kind of in the way that today, much more likely, prolonged stress may induce a form of anxiety disorder like we were talking about earlier. Here in the 1890s, you would wind up seeing symptoms play themselves out, not so much as in generalized anxiety disorder, but more so as hysterical blindness or some other form of conversion disorder. Variations of somatic disorders would be a pain disorder, one where a person claims to experience pain. And now this is certainly something that you might wind up seeing as a medical doctor. A person claims to have pain, but upon a medical investigation, there's no evidence for any kind of tissue damage, nerve damage, or other thing. You just have the person reporting it. Now, the person's not faking and they're not lying. If they're faking or lying, obviously it's not a pain disorder. It's not there to describe liars or people who are faking just because they want to get some OxyContin or some other type of medication. In this case, the person truly actually perceives pain. And in a case like this, it's difficult to treat. Largely, the treatment has to take place through a psychological treatment process to understand what stress may be in the person's life, to help them alleviate or manage it, and also to run through very likely scenarios like systematic desensitization that we've talked about before, where you can use a form of relaxation training with the individual to try to get them to experience less pain and then keep them under that state for longer and longer periods of time so they start to develop more mental control over the pain experience itself. A somatization disorder is a more general type of disorder which will look oftentimes like hypochondriasis on the very bottom of the screen. Somatization disorder is more general than a conversion disorder where you might just have hysterical blindness, or pain disorder where specifically pain. Somatization disorder, you may wind up with a type of symptom that comes and goes and moves around your body. Today your knees hurt. Tomorrow you can't hear so well. The following day you have an upset stomach. The day after that your back hurts. The day after that your back is fine, but your elbows hurt. The problem, the medical disorder, just keeps bouncing around and bouncing around. That's different from hypochondriasis in that a person who's a hypochondriac thinks they have specific types of disorders. Like they heard that the West Nile virus is in the United States, and so they start thinking that they got malaria. That's the kind of thing. They start identifying a type of cancer that they think they have, or a tumor, or another type of disease. They're a little bit more specific about what they think they have. And the symptoms that they have are always related to something that they can kind of identify now, not so much with a medical book, but by going on WebMD and saying, oh my God, I think I got all those symptoms. I must have, Epstein-Barr. That one's kind of vague, right? I feel tired and I feel crappy. I probably have Epstein-Barr. The body dysmorphic disorder, that one is also similar, but more specifically related to an instance where a person will perceive their body much differently than an outside observer. So they may consistently see or perceive that their stomach is really fat, or that they're too skinny. Unlikely actually skinny, but although that is a possibility, they will find fault with their body, and then they will focus and kind of obsess about this one disorder that they're perceiving, that they perceive they see or experience, although nobody else really notices it. They think their eyebrows are asymmetric, but it really gets to them and it annoys the crap out of them, and they kind of obsess about it. And that would kind of fit a body dysmorphic disorder type of process. In the next disorder, bipolar and related disorders. Bipolar disorder is one in which a person has mood swings from a very high excitable state, and this is not a happy time, but it's a very excitable manic state, and then a depressive state separately. The swing from a manic to a depressive state can occur with different amplitudes and different wavelengths over time. The size of the amplitude and the length of the wavelength establishes the specific subtype of bipolar disorder that the individual has. So if you take a look at bipolar 1, that's the more, or essentially the most common type, that when you hear people talk about bipolar disorder, there's an intense manic phase, and then the person has a ride down through normalcy and all the way into depression, and then they come back out. It's a high amplitude, oftentimes very long wavelength, which might run over the course of months. But there are other variations like cyclothymia, which has a lower amplitude and oftentimes repeats itself more rapidly. In fact, cyclothymia may even repeat itself over the course of a 2-week cycle. One of the things to be aware of about these disorders is that the amplitude and the wavelength are generally correlated together. So longer wavelengths are generally associated with higher amplitudes, and of course at the other end, shorter wavelengths generally have lower amplitudes. So those two things tend to go together. Now, depressive disorders, which are separate from bipolar, depressive disorder is something that you see only when you have the depressant side of the disorder that you saw in bipolar. Depression itself has a few, you see here, variations to it. A major depressive disorder or persistent depressive disorder called dysthymia or premenstrual dysphoric disorder. These are all variations in which depression becomes the primary symptom that you see in this particular disorder. It is simply one half of that sine wave you saw in bipolar. So in fact, if you drew a sine wave on a page and then sliced it down the horizontal axis and removed all of the emotional stages for mania on the top, and then you just had a sequence of unrelated depressive links on the bottom, that's largely how depressive disorder plays itself out over time. An individual will go through a depressive period, and then they'll go through a period of normalcy, and then there'll just be a depressive period again after that. These other ones, the persistent depressive disorder called dysthymia, is really just a more low-grade form of disorder that occurs over a lengthy period. And the premenstrual dysphoric disorder is, of course, related to PMS, premenstrual syndrome. And that does actually occur, although it's not a PC diagnosis. It is something that actually is recognized by the medical community and psychologists as well. Schizophrenia is the next category. Schizophrenia has 5 areas of disturbance that you'll see here: perceptual, language, thought, emotional, and behavioral disturbances. In general, schizophrenia occurs randomly in about 1% of the general population. So for 2 individuals, a husband and a wife that have children, there's a very low chance that they will have a child that develops schizophrenia later in life, even though there's no schizophrenia in either the husband or wife's families going back in time. So it does occur, though. So it seems as though there may be some setting events, potentially environmental ones. There has been some evidence back in the 90s indicating that schizophrenia may actually be caused by exposure to a virus. But there's not enough clear evidence to state that as fact. But the idea, though, is to beware. Something may happen. It may be environmental, or there may be genetic causes as well that might exist due to random changes in genes, even from individuals that do not have it in their family, so that they can produce a child with it. But it is at a very low rate. Overall, as I mentioned, if you look at the global population, this is really a global standard here. 1% of the human population can be diagnosed with schizophrenia. You do see a genetic cause, because if you have a pair of fraternal twins and one develops symptoms, there is a 10% chance that the alternate twin will develop it. And if you have a pair of identical twins and one twin develops symptoms, then there's a 50% chance that the alternate identical twin will develop symptoms as well. The issue here is that if schizophrenia was purely a genetic disorder and one identical twin had it, then there's a 100% chance that the alternate identical twin would get it. At least a very high, right? Over 90% chance, so that you would just call it a straightforward genetic disorder. But the fact that it's a 50% rate indicates that the disorder occurs not just from a genetic process, but rather from an environmental process as well, because there are no other sources of control of behavior. There's biology and there's environment. Even the biopsychosocial model, when you take the environmental component and call it psychological and social, it's still an environmental input. The environmental input here that's really relevant is somewhat of a loosey-goosey term: stress. The amount of stress in your life and your ability to deal with stress will be one of the setting issues with whether or not the symptomology actually appears. And schizophrenia oftentimes works largely like a lot of other disorders, like diabetes, for example. If you're going to get diabetes, it's going to be because first, you have the gene for diabetes, and then secondly, you have a lifestyle like eating and exercise and so forth that leads to the development of diabetes. But once you turn the diabetes genes on so that it is expressed, you can't just go to a health spa and say, okay, I'm going to start relaxing, exercising, and eating right. I'm going to get rid of my diabetes. And that's not the case anymore. Once you kick the gene on, you're stuck with it. And that's what happens here with schizophrenia. For an individual that is not showing symptoms but comes from a family in which schizophrenia has been expressed, those individuals should be very careful about the way in which they deal with stress and the amount of stress that they put themselves under, if they have the 20 separate genes that are necessary for schizophrenia to occur. Because as you get into psychological disorders, you will see very much unlike many medical disorders, psychological disorders are coming from a wide range of systems, and schizophrenia itself at the current time has a minimum of 20 genes that must occur before the symptomology can actually be present. And so as a result, you can't just get schizophrenia from having a wacky, wild, stressful life. If you don't have the genes for it, then you're never going to show the symptoms of schizophrenia. Dissociative disorders. Dissociative disorders are ones that have oftentimes played themselves out in the popular media quite a bit. As you see, Sybil and multiple personality disorder are things that oftentimes play out themselves in popular psychology issues. Dissociative disorders are defined by a person's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that are supposed to come from a separated or split conscious awareness, so that instead of having one consciousness for you, there's a split consciousness of some sort that gives you two personalities, or three personalities, or four personalities, and so on. Dissociative identity disorder, which you see in the fourth position there, that's the multiple personality disorder that most people refer to, that would be related to the original story of Sybil, who was supposed to have, I think, 16 different personalities. What's important to recognize, though, and here we go again with Freud, is that the story of Sybil and her 16 personalities was a complete and total fake. It was a lie. It never happened, and it was a made-up story that a psychiatrist created and identified one of the patients that this psychiatrist was working on as having all of these personalities. The book became popular, which was Sybil, and then it got turned into a movie, and then it became, multiple personality became very much in the forefront of popular culture at that time in the 1970s. The lie went on and on and on, and by the time the lie was outed that the psychiatrist admitted to making up the entire story, of course, nobody cares. And, obviously the people from the media are not going to go back and say, whoopsie, we screwed up and repeated a lie for decades. It just gets left alone. So now people think that, Sybil was a person with 16 personalities, but it just never happened. It's one of many, kind of corruptions of information in the field of psychology that exist. The story, though, how this is connected to Freud, is that the woman who was originally Sybil was an art professor in Kentucky, a woman, and she was just having some emotional problems dealing with her life, and she was going to see a psychoanalyst. And it was the psychoanalyst that kind of got the whole thing started. So that's the whole connection again back to Freud. The whole idea of dissociative identity disorder, split personality, was originally a Freudian concept back from the 1930s. And it was really only the Freudians that actually dealt with this as a potential type of disorder. Many other fields of psychology just simply discredited the notion and didn't feel that you could actually have multiple personalities in a single individual. But as the original individual was being treated by a psychoanalyst, the psychoanalyst decided to retire and sold his practice to a new psychiatrist who was also Freudian. And it was the new psychiatrist who decided simply to make some money by writing a fake story about 16 personalities and attributing it to one of his patients. And that's basically the story of Sybil. If you look up Sybil, the story of Sybil on Google now, you'll find a Wikipedia page which will explain much more of this whole story overall. One of the other aspects of dissociative identity disorder, without me really kind of going through all of these components, is dissociative disorders primarily exist in North America and mostly in the United States. It appears to be primarily a culturally related form of disorder, and we're going to see this in a few slides that we're going to reach. There are some forms of psychological disorder that literally occur primarily within general geopolitical boundaries. So that you identify a country like Brazil or the United States or Canada, and a psychological disorder will exist in that border based upon a person's life experience growing up in that culture and the social environment and the interplay of all the aspects of the biopsychosocial model. You will wind up with a select type of disorder in that geopolitical area. Dissociative disorders primarily exist in North America, and probably more so, dissociative identity disorder primarily exists in the United States. And because it's so select in the United States, most psychiatrists from other countries won't even recognize it as a disorder. So, if you committed a crime, for example, in the United States, you murdered somebody, you got on a plane, you flew to France, and then you got arrested there, you can't claim that it was your other personality that committed the murder in the United States and then get off as a result. And in fact, even if you got sent back to the United States, that whole dissociative identity disorder would probably be brought up as part of your court case. But my guess is you'd probably be sent to prison, but with psychiatric treatment included in your prison stay. Although many decades ago, I think there was probably a greater chance that you might actually avoid prison if you had dissociative identity disorder. But then as people started to get identified as faking the disorder as a way to get away with crime, the criminal justice system just basically throws you in prison for crimes and then just says, well, if you're psychologically disordered, then we'll just get you help while you're in prison serving out your sentence. In the terms of the personality disorders, what we have here are characteristics which represent your personality. Now, personality generally refers to a long-standing characteristic that's in your pattern of behavior. Everybody essentially has personality types. They are characteristics about us that last over long periods of time, possibly your life or even decades over the course of time. That's essentially what categorizes a personality characteristic, just the fact that a thing lasts for a long time. Now, there are some characteristics that become problematic for individuals, like paranoia, antisocial behavior, histrionic behavior, narcissistic behavior, which is certainly one of the more popular ones. If you go on YouTube and type in narcissistic personality disorder, you'll be inundated with hits because for people that do clinical psychology, they know there's so many people that like to demean each other by calling each other narcissistic because they're on social media too much, that you see a lot of videos about narcissistic behavior. And that's really just an outgrowth of culture because of social media, right? So you have a form of technology, the internet. The internet turns into social media. Social media turns into a lot of people using these social media sites. And then people start to point at each other and say, you do this too much, you think you're important, you're a narcissist. That idea becomes popular, and then you wind up seeing a lot of focus on narcissism on the internet. And that's all that is. It's largely a cultural aspect that you kind of dwell in now that will probably eventually just go away as the role of social media changes over time. We are still in a very early stage for that, and this whole story of narcissism, which is really kind of an outgrowth of social psychology, where you blame people for being bad, which is an entirely separate social psychological issue. We'll deal with it another time. Really kind of leads to this whole story of narcissism. But if you look at these personality disorders, notice that you don't have any kind of personality disorder you want. There are select ones that generally cause problems for individuals, like a paranoid personality disorder, which means nothing more than the person expresses paranoia much more frequently than anybody else does, and that it causes them problems because most people usually don't like their paranoid thought patterns. So this person has difficulty maintaining social relationships. The person may realize that they do act in a paranoid fashion and that they don't really like it, and they certainly violate norms. So you wind up with a yes, 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 yes for the 4 categories of psychological disorder, and thereby you have paranoid personality disorder as a category that you can identify in the DSM. So paranoia is pretty straightforward. Antisocial is one where, for lack of a better term, let's basically say this in the simplest way, a person with an antisocial personality disorder basically says no to everything. It doesn't matter what you want or what should be done, what the norms of society are, they're just always going to say no. You can't tell me what to do, and they go do something else. And as you might imagine, somebody who lives their life that way does not do well in the job market. They don't do well making friends. They usually wind up in a lifelong period of poverty, tapping into Social Security, living in a bad area because they are largely going to be at the lowest rungs of economic stability because they just don't get along with anybody. Borderline personality disorder is largely related to an individual who does not feel as though they have kind of one personality. They find themselves feeling a little bit lost, not certain what they want. That's the borderline aspect of it. They don't feel settled, and so they try things out and don't try things, and they're not really sure what they like or don't like. Oftentimes, borderline personality becomes associated with mild forms of depression. Histrionic personality disorder, just like narcissistic personality disorder, is kind of named well enough that it just tells you exactly what is happening there. A person with a histrionic personality disorder is histrionic. They become excitable at things all the time. And the person who's narcissistic is always talking about themselves, whatever is happening in the world, whether it's the federal government or international relations or something in your neighborhood. They always find a way to bring the story back to them. That's largely what narcissism is. And obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which, as you might imagine, is probably going to be a little bit more popular, or I shouldn't say popular, a little bit more common, given the high rates of anxiety in society today. An obsessive compulsive personality disorder is going to be reflected in an individual who may not have a clear OCD, as we've talked about before, but that this obsessive and compulsive patterns of behavior is always there regardless of what they're actually doing. So it's almost like a generalized OCD where the OCD pattern gets applied to any new thing that the person does during the course of the day. It's like a generalized pattern in the way in which they deal with the world. And that, of course, as you might imagine, creates a great deal of problem in their personal life, difficulty to maintain relationships, hold a job, and so forth. And these individuals wind up with a variety of additional problems that come about as a result of that obsessive compulsive personality. Now, on the next slide here, there's a list of culturally specific disorders, which is, I think, good to take a look at, get an idea of how they play themselves out. This is not a complete set. And in fact, the idea that a disorder can be culturally confined really only goes back to the 1980s, right? So over the past 40 years, psychiatrists have been recognizing these types of disorders, and disorders themselves don't always stay the same, as I mentioned. Because culture changes, disorders will change. And so it's all but guaranteed that you will see disorders in the future, decades from now, that simply don't exist today. And some of those disorders may exist in particular geopolitical areas, like it'll only be in Alaska or Japan, or it'll only exist in Tibet. But those are the kinds of disorders that you'll see that will fit this kind of story. Anorexia nervosa has been around for at least 2,000 years. Do not believe the stories that anorexia is caused by young girls looking at too many Vogue magazines. That is a popular psychology myth. There are clear indications back in ancient Roman times where medical doctors repeatedly describe anorexia. It exists primarily in Western countries. Why Western countries and not Eastern countries? I don't have a clue. And I think there's not a lot of good answer why otherwise. It certainly does seem to be related to culture. What it is about Western culture, and that is a very broad category, right? Western culture, involving all of Europe and all of the countries that Europeans had settled over the past 500 to 600 years, is extraordinarily broad. So, anorexia is primarily a type of disorder seen in Western society. Multiple personality disorder, as I've mentioned before, primarily exists in the United States and almost nowhere else. The next one, attack de nervios, exists primarily in Latin cultures. So this is essentially south of Texas. That's really what's being referred to. Not referred to Spain, but just south of Texas plus the Caribbean, you may see this. And what is it? Well, something bad happens and a person has a nervous attack, right? They have essentially an anxiety attack, but it plays out in specific ways to the particular Latin culture, and that's it. You wouldn't see it in the United States because the same particular cultural process of dealing with stress or how you're supposed to respond to finding out that your child was hit by a car, for example, is different. In fact, as a way to kind of just compare that, it was more common, I think, in general, that you would hear about people fainting like 150 years ago, in particular women, right? They find out that something bad had happened and they would faint. You don't really see that much anymore. People don't faint. Fainting because a bad event occurred is almost seen as silly now, and I think for part of that reason, it's why fainting largely went away as an issue. And I think that fainting and attack of nerves is really just plays out the same way. Brain fog occurs generally in West Africa, and I think this is probably more so northwestern Africa, like around the Ivory Coast and so forth. Brain fog is an issue where a person might do too much academic work. Like, as you might imagine, as an upper level undergraduate or even as a graduate student, when you do so much darn homework that you start to feel foggy headed. But now try to imagine that you perceive that foggy headedness all the time and you have difficulty concentrating. This sounds actually very much like things even myself I've experienced in graduate school when I've just done too much damn work, read too many articles, wrote too much papers, spent my entire weekend writing articles to get homework done on time. But I've never experienced it as kind of a permanent condition. It seems more so that in West Africa in general, the cultures there kind of have built up brain fog as an issue so that as a member of society, you get the idea that brain fog is something that might just stay with you. Rather than maybe for me or other Americans, you do kind of feel foggy headed, but after a night's sleep or a bike ride or just a day off from doing homework, you're back to yourself again. Possession by the Tsar occurs specifically in Ethiopia, nowhere else. What is possession by the Tsar? Well, it's essentially a process where a person speaks gibberish, where it would be referred to as talking in tongues. So the person appears to be possessed by an evil spirit. And they'll go into trance states, and largely this occurs as a result of connection to religious activities. Running amok, which is a disorder, occurs in Southeast Asia. This actually even got into our own language. So if you said somebody was running amok, everybody would know somebody was running around crazy. And that's essentially what running amok actually is. A person goes through a brief period of generalized violence. They will leave their house and just tear stuff up, knock over trash cans, bust windows, punch people in the face. It's this kind of stereotype of this crazy person running in the streets, punching people and causing damage. That's what running amok is. And then it exists largely in Southeast Asia. You don't largely see it elsewhere. But it comes as a result of extensive stress and bad events occurring in the person's life that at one point you say they snap, right? Nobody really snaps. Snapping is a kind of a culturally recognized thing where you reach your limit at that very moment and you feel you can't control yourself any longer. And then you start exhibiting all this violence. And the last one, Koro, which also exists in Southeast Asia, but also in China, is a very odd disorder that at least people in North America would find somewhat amusing. The idea of Koro is a belief by an individual that their penis is shrinking inside of their body, and that when their penis fully shrinks inside of their body, that they're going to die. And that disorder, which seems extremely odd to a person from North America, is actually something that actually does exist in that area of the world, all right, in South China, Vietnam. And in fact, Koro even took place throughout India, I think sometime around 15 years ago. So much so that a rash of Coro started to occur in India. So much so that the health departments of India began driving cars around through the streets with loudspeakers on top of them, announcing that Coro was not a real thing and that nobody really had it and that nobody was going to die if their penis shrunk up inside their body. Now, odd as that seems, a multiple personality disorder must seem equally as odd to somebody from Vietnam, where you really do not see or even hear about multiple personality disorder. So the fact that these types of disorders occur is something that you should be aware of in terms of disorders, and know that, over the course of your life, if you got into psychiatry, there literally may be disorders you'll see decades from now that simply don't exist at the current time. And the last slide here for this particular section of psychological disorders comes from the whole story that we've kind of actually already dealt with in the previous lecture. And this is the whole story of the biological basis of nervous system disorders. As time goes by, more and more biological basis to psychological disorders is developed. And it's good that that's occurring because it reins in the theorizing about the psychological disorders. It does not negate much of the theorizing from psychologists, though, because at least after 1950, most of the psychological theorizing about disorders has been done in a much more scientific fashion than prior to the 1950s. And certainly, even if you just stick with the 21st century and didn't look at any references prior to 2000, you would see that the field of psychology squarely is relying on these biological principles to put parameters on psychological disorders, so you know how to direct your understanding of psychological principles. It does not seem likely that the field of medicine, for example, will fully envelop psychological disorders, because much of the things that are relevant currently are functional processes that occur from human-human interaction, which is based upon culture and constantly changes, so you don't have very good set biological parameters to it. It is necessary to find the biological parameters to a disorder, but it's also going to be necessary to maintain the psychological principles to understand how people interact with each other to help induce these disorders. So at least in this chart, on this figure, schizophrenia, as I mentioned, there's a minimum of 20 genes that are necessary. In terms of depression, there are clear changes in the reduction of the amount of dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine in those particular pathways. In neurodevelopmental disorders, they are related to intellectual disabilities, ADHD, autism spectrum disorder. These disorders always develop at an early stage, which is why they're classified as neurodevelopmental disorders. Nobody develops mental retardation at age 50. Okay, if it's not there at an early age, you never get diagnosed with it. So you don't get developed with ADHD when you're 60 years old. And if you did, what the doctor would say was, oh, this went undiagnosed your whole life. Because the assumption is ADHD is a part of a process that is with you from the time that you're born and just gets expressed at an early stage in your life. And certainly in the neurocognitive disorders like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, they are probably some of the most medically oriented psychological disorders that you see. In fact, those treatments for those are probably mostly outside the realm of psychology, mostly within the realm of medicine, although psychological aspects that come about of having those diseases certainly should be treated by a psychologist. And the last section here that we have in this area is the section on stress. And we have actually talked about some of this stuff again. The Princeton Review book is duplicating some of this material a little bit from the end of the previous chapter. Stress, in general, really comes from your own personal point of view, how you appraise a situation. You know, as we talked about seeing a bear in the woods in the past, some people who come across a bear in the woods may find it to be a fantastically lucky thing that they were rewarded that day by God to see one of a magnificent creature from the forest. And other people will crap their pants and run away because they're afraid of being killed. So it depends on how you see the situation. This exact same thing, right? You and your friend can both get a 65 on a math test, and your friend will be like, well, whatever, I know, this is not a good grade, but I'm going to have to work harder next time. I may even pay for a tutor. And then you may lose a day and a half because of the amount of stress and anxiety that you feel bad and the self-hatred you have for yourself for having gotten a 65. It was the exact same 65. Right? It is the exact same situation. Both of you appraised the situation, identified what was happening in a slightly different way. This issue is actually very important for the field of psychology because for those individuals that have extreme forms of anxiety, they have to learn how to appraise situations in their life in a way that minimizes the disruptive stress. No one says you have to be an individual that thinks everything's good in life, that may be somewhat unrealistic. But to appraise something so that it stops you from responding and doing anything in the future is absolutely against your own benefit. And some people have to learn how to reappraise events in their life so they don't become overwhelmed with anxiety. Now, the responses to stress, certainly when you have stress, you're going to see it in terms of sympathetic arousal primarily, hormonal activity. Most of this stuff should probably seem familiar to you guys because most of you are probably biochem majors. The role of corticotropin releasing hormone, the pituitary adrenal axis, ATCH. All of these aspects are common stress reactions that had been identified since around the 1950s. But identifying the underlying biological principles of stress does not help you so much deal with it, except in the short term. Because if a person has an extremely strong stress reaction, that is a really bad anxiety problem, you might treat the person with a pill, so that would affect some of the hormonal or neuropharmacological aspects that are occurring in their brain. But they're going to have to learn how to appraise stress in their life. They'll look at the world and reevaluate what happens in a less harmful manner to themselves so that they don't induce such strong stressors. And as they learn to do that, they can then eventually come off the medicine. And that is always your kind of gold standard for the treatment of a psychological disorder. A person may start being treated by getting medication, but your ultimate goal is to get them off of medication so that you don't run the risk of developing permanent long-term side effects. And that largely is the end of this particular chapter.